Welcome to a recording of Beyond Conscious Self by Wanjiru Warama, copyright 2020, narrated by Carrie Wimmer. To Neil Kabi, your life is precious. Author's note, it's why I write. My idea of writing a book sparked in 1997 from a business book that I've since tried to locate without success. In it, the author asked readers to list 50 activities they would do if money were not an issue. I wrote my list with all the zeal I could muster. Although I don't recall how many items I listed, 50 seemed too many. I doubt I wrote more than 16. Whatever the number, the prospect of achieving such unhindered success enthused me so much that I had to tell somebody. One day I'll write a book, I said in one of our conversations. You're not famous, my friend Diane said and gave me a quick sideways look. Her retort jabbed my feelings, but my brain failed to generate a suitable quick comeback. Instead, I tightened my lips and weathered the hurt without a word. I suppose it didn't matter because in a week or two, as it usually happens, my well-thought-out list fell by the wayside. But for an unexplained reason and without my awareness, my desire to write a book percolated in my head for years before it bubbled out and reached a point when I had to write to get relief. A love affair with books. The Friends of the Library. One hot afternoon in 1999, I took a break from my real estate prospecting to cool off at the Malcolm X Library on Market Street in San Diego, California. Standing between high bookshelves, I flipped through pages in a book when I heard something that caught my attention. I perked my ears so I could hear better. From a table by the wall, two women talked about the Friends of the Library. They sounded quite involved in whatever project they discussed. I didn't understand how people could be friends with a library. What does Friends of the Library mean? I asked the attendant when I went to the checkout counter. The Friends, he said, they meet on the second Saturday of the month, I think at noon, in one of the rooms. He pointed. You can attend their meetings if you like. That didn't tell me much, but I had the date and time that he confirmed from the computer calendar. The following month, I attended a Friends of the Library meeting. The secretary distributed the agenda and soon the chairwoman opened the meeting. After the introductions, members discussed each item on the agenda. Although I didn't follow the discussion, I liked the idea of being a part of a group associated with the library. When the meeting ended, the secretary gave me some literature to take home with me. From the brochures, I gleaned that the Friends of the San Diego Public Library was, and still is, a nonprofit corporation chartered by the city of San Diego. Members volunteered to raise money and support their local branch libraries for summer reading, computer and adult literacy classes, after-school homework assistance, citywide student essay contests, and other community enrichment activities that the city or state's budgets didn't cover. At my third meeting, I signed up as a member. After several meetings, however, I remained unclear about how the Friends applied the matching funds collected and sent to the city, and how the Malcolm X Library chapter worked with the other Friends of the Library chapters in the city. Besides, they held meetings on Saturdays, the day most people took off from work, and the ideal time for home buyers to preview homes. A real estate professional at the time, I weighed my work versus attending the Friends meetings and keeping up with activities. But I soon learned that a member could attend meetings and events occasionally, or not at all. Besides, as I soon learned, only about 8 to 12 people attended the meetings on a regular basis, and of those, only about 8 worked on the bulk of activities. So I paced myself. After 3 years, I felt involved and dedicated enough to sign up as a lifetime member of the Friends of the San Diego Public Library. The Fundraiser. In 2012, the Friends chapter at the Malcolm X Library, with about 40 members, elected me president. Besides managing affairs and coordinating the activities of the chapter, with the help of the committee members, I chaired our local chapter's monthly meetings. I also attended the corporate monthly meetings for all 35 Friends of the Library chapter presidents. We networked, and gave report updates on our individual chapters' activities. Once a year at the end of summer, my chapter used to organize a fundraiser that we called Gift Day, a name proposed by one of our members and community elder, AUC Kwayana. During Gift Day, community members and area businesses donated money or items that we sold through silent auctions. By my election, however, Gift Day had been defunct for 5 years. After I assumed office, I made Gift Day my centerpiece and pushed to revive it. We set up the fundraiser event for September 28, 2012. Members organized, sold tickets, and solicited funds and other donations from the community and local businesses. Donations came in checks, gift certificates, and other items for the silent auction. After we tallied the ticket sales, it turned out we had sold more tickets than we had room for in the meeting space. But that didn't concern me, because I knew some people bought tickets and never showed up at the event. But not everything worked out that well. Each potential guest speaker we had shortlisted and approached couldn't come because of a prior engagement. We gave up on guest speakers 1 week before the event. Instead, members decided that I, as the president, should give a short speech during the guest speaker's slot. Nobody mentioned the topic I should talk about, but as I learned later, 2 of our members wanted me to merely introduce myself, welcome our guests, and sit back down. My speaking for more than 2 to 3 minutes, according to them, amounted to self-promotion. But self-promotion didn't feature anywhere in my mind. My concern revolved around how to come up with a viable speech, which I believed was my duty as the president, and give it in front of that many people. Except for the mediocre presentations I gave during my business classes in college or one-on-one real estate presentations, I had never had to speak to a large group of people. But I reasoned 1 week seemed long enough for me to come up with a suitable topic, as long as I kept my wits about me during the presentation. By the eve of the event, however, I had worried myself silly and still had no idea what I would talk about. Finally, by 8 p.m., a kind of relaxation swept through me, and my mind cleared. Why not talk about myself? Came to mind. A talk on my love for books and how they had changed my life sounded like a good topic. It ought to be interesting to a library crowd, I concluded. I moved to my desk and without any further preparation, opened a blank Word document and started pecking on my laptop keyboard. By 11 p.m., to my relief and surprise, although it didn't seem odd at the time, I had finished and proofread several pages of my speech. The following day, Friday evening of September 28, 2012, at the Malcolm X Library Multipurpose Community Room, before a standing room only crowd of about 100 to 150 people, I read the following. My love affair with books. This love affair started a long time ago in a small village known as Solai in the Great Rift Valley in Kenya. I had no knowledge of libraries then, but my brother Joseph, my senior by 2 years, had established himself as the village's librarian of sorts. He tirelessly hunted down old beat-up, sometimes coverless novels and comics. After reading a book, he would pass it on to me. In a few days, I would finish reading it, and he would pass it on to someone else. I had no knowledge of where those books came from or how the circulation worked, but those free, beat-up books opened my mind and expanded my thinking beyond my village of thatch and mud circular houses with conical roofs. Before those summer readings, in grade 6, I believed there were 2 countries that mattered in the world, Kenya, for the Africans, and England, where all the white people came from. In my reading, however, I came across other countries with strange-sounding names like China, America, Russia, and many others. I had heard of India because of Mr. Patel, who ran the Patel General Store, but for some reason that didn't count. I read about love affairs, crime, cowboys, and other people who did not live as we did. My mind traveled to those faraway lands, and at times I forgot my surroundings as if in a trance. I wondered whether someone from a village like me could visit any of those strange countries. I cautioned myself not to get excited by such far-fetched possibilities. But in the process, however, I became sure of one thing. I did not want to spend my life doing back-breaking physical labor like my mother. The least I could do now was to forget such lofty ideas and get some education first. To my relief, after 8 years in school, a pathway opened to a life outside the farm when I beat the local statistics and became the second girl, the first had reached grade 10, in my village to attend high school. It took more than 4 years before another girl in the neighboring village went to high school. A handful of villagers acted surprised and talked among themselves about my father choosing to waste his money to send a girl to high school. One man went as far as telling my mother to try to convince my father to stop the waste and save his money for his son's education. A staunch supporter of education, my mother did not breathe a word of this to my father. In high school, I did not know libraries existed besides the bookshelf I saw in the principal's office. By then, my brother's book circulation had long dried up, and the only option remaining was to concentrate on the textbooks supplied by the school. Through sheer tenacity, during one of the worst periods of my life when I lacked school fees, money for necessities, and faced other difficulties, I finished high school and moved to Nairobi, Kenya's capital city. I saw a library for the first time. It had hundreds of books. I became excited when I thought of all the options books could give me. Others must have been excited too, especially students, because the place stayed busy till closing time. Despite my quiet country girl shy ways, I bubbled on the inside. With a high school diploma and access to the books, I felt sure I would have a good life. First, I needed to earn a living and help my family, then get some more education despite my humble beginnings. Meanwhile, I settled into city life. Nairobi looked beautiful and clean, but the idea of going to those faraway places persisted and stayed with me. I did not care to which faraway land I went. I could have gone to Timbuktu for all I cared. As it turned out, I landed in San Diego, where I didn't know a soul, but a public library, better stocked than the one I sing praises for in Nairobi, opened its doors to welcome me. Books thus became, and still are, my loyal companions and mentors. This year, 2012, the Friends honored me and elected me the president of the Friends of the Malcolm X Library chapter. I have appreciated the library even more after I saw how committed the friends and employees are to providing the best service for patrons. Occasionally, I remember that Kenyan girl of a long time ago. She grew up, and her life turned out more than just okay. But thousands of other boys and girls replaced her many times over, and they remain without a library or books to read. What would I tell a girl in Solai now, who leads a life similar to the one I led all those decades ago? I would tell her about a library and describe it as best I could and hope she and her parents understand. I would also tell her about people called the Friends of San Diego Public Library, and particularly the Friends of Malcolm X Library. These friends are all volunteers who advocate for the library to prevent budget cuts, closure of libraries, or reduced library hours. Politicians respect voters who speak in one voice. The Friends also promote and fundraise to support libraries' programs. I would also tell her things like, 1. The Friends of the Library is a 501c3 corporation, and any contributions and donations are tax-deductible. 2. When we raise and send money to the city's matching fund section, it is matched dollar for dollar. 100% of our contribution plus 50% of the matched funds is sent back and spent on our branch library's needs. 3. When libraries are threatened with closure or reduced hours, Malcolm X Library is always high on the list since, unfortunately, we have one of the lowest circulations in the city, and that frustrates me very much. 4. Everyone can choose to donate to the Friends of the Library. Regular yearly membership is just $10, or $5 for a senior. A lifetime membership is $500. 5. Finally, I would tell her not to judge fundraiser attendees or other contributors too harshly because they may be too busy with their personal lives or do not appreciate how libraries change lives. But tonight, all I ask is, when you go home, not to forget our community's library. Come and borrow books. Bring your children or grandchildren, family, and friends to patronize the library, and take advantage of the enrichment programs offered here. You can also choose to be a member of the Friends and send or drop a donation. Thank you for your attention. Wanjiru Warama, President, Friends of Malcolm X Library. Gift Day Fundraiser, September 28, 2012. Fundraiser Aftermath. After my speech, one woman congratulated me and said, "You could hear a pin drop." From the stillness of the crowd while I read, and the punctuating hand claps that had energized me, I believed her and wallowed in her praises. Every part of the fundraiser went according to our plan and turned out much bigger and better organized than ever before. As the guests enjoyed refreshments and networked, I floated around with euphoric satisfaction, thanking some of them and collecting kudos. Most guests left by the 9:30 ending time, and we, the friends and the librarian and his helper, rushed to clear and straighten the room and left between 10 o'clock and 10:15 p.m. When I woke up the next morning, Saturday, September 29th, I felt strange. Something had changed. Others, without form and invincible, had colonized my mind while I slept. Stories bubbled in my head, literally. They jostled each other like a group of bratty children vying for my attention. I didn't know what to make of it. So I lay in bed for a long moment, intrigued and fearful, my head filled with questions. Have I gone mad or become psychotic? Is this the divine intervention people talk about? Did it help me write the fundraiser speech without difficulty 2 nights ago? Had I been mistaken to dismiss people's similar claims before? So many questions and no answers. When I got out of bed, I started on my usual routine, reading the newspaper, showering, breakfast, and doing my half-a-day work at home before I went to the office. The noisy stories in my head didn't hinder me in any way. They stood by and only resumed their chatter when I finished or when my mind remained unengaged. But I still believed it was an onset of mental illness or an aberration. Nonetheless, I enjoyed the drama that tickled and amused me. Even when driving, I sometimes chuckled or burst out laughing in exhilaration. But my concern never ebbed as the spectacle persisted from one day to the next. By the 4th day, my head felt like a riot. Each story increased its volume so I could hear it over the others. Meanwhile, I kept a prior appointment with my then doctor at his clinic in Pacific Beach, San Diego. It never occurred to me to mention my unusual experience to him, perhaps because the voices stayed quiet during our session. But the minute I stepped outside the clinic, the voices erupted. The pressure in my head felt like an excessive tickle, too much of a good thing. By the time I reached where I parked my car, I determined I couldn't go on like that. Before I started my car, it occurred to me to write the story of the loudest voice. I pulled out a yellow pad I always carried in my car, and the words poured onto the page while my hand wrote whatever came out. When I finished writing, the unexpected happened. The voice that had bombarded my head quieted and stayed in the background. What relief! Now I could enjoy the stories, and if a voice bothered me too much, I could hush it by merely writing the story it dictated. Subsequently, I wrote about 4 or 5 stories, but at the time those stories featured low on my list of priorities. Besides my real estate business, a lawsuit weighed me down. It had drained me so much that in a month I would scurry out of town to go replenish my soul. So instead of writing the stories, I did the next best thing. I jotted down the titles of the stories that nagged me, starting with the loudest. The voices didn't go away entirely. They still entertained me, but they mellowed as if they knew I would attend to them in due course. The list contained about 15 to 18 potential stories, long enough to make a whole book. I planned to develop those stories when my work schedule eased. Meanwhile, I wished I could tell someone about the clamor in my head, but I feared whoever I told would look at me askance and forever wonder about my mental state. And who knew who else the person might tell? So, I enjoyed the interaction and kept the strange experience to myself. To my surprise and dismay, on the following Saturday, exactly 1 week later, I woke up and my head felt clear as never before. My voices had disappeared at night and left a vacuum. I missed them. I hesitated to leave my bed and instead mused about it for a while. Will they ever return? Well, perhaps one day. About a month later, I took a trip outside the country to shed work strains and whatever else that bogged me down. During my travel, I truly lived in the here and now and enjoyed almost every minute of it. On my return to California, I resumed my chores, but I couldn't shake off the void left by the voices that had colonized my mind for a week. Perhaps I needed to write the stories the voices had touted. I pulled out the yellow pad that I had written the story titles on over a month prior and congratulated myself for having the foresight to do that. I promised myself that no matter how busy I became, I would write 1 or 2 stories a week. But when I went through the list, my writing pledge melted into nothingness. No matter how much I concentrated on my thoughts, I couldn't develop any of the topics I jotted down, not one. I looked at the list again and appraised some of the items in wonder. Why did I write these? I regretted I hadn't dropped everything and drafted every story that had nagged me. I mulled about my ignorance for the whole of December while I searched online for places I could learn about writing the kind of stories I read in magazines and books. In January 2013, I got reelected as the president of the Friends of the San Diego Public Library, Malcolm X Library Chapter. I also joined the La Mesa Creative Writers Group. During the 3-hour afternoon session, the facilitator used the first half hour to talk about the basics of writing. Except for the 15-minute break, the rest of the time the potential authors read and critiqued each other's writing. A person could read a maximum of 5 letter-size pages, double-spaced. I became so intimidated by the good stories some people read, I doubted I could write anything even close. But with an attitude of, if someone can do it, I can do it too. In the 3rd week, I read a 3-page piece while I trembled half the time. Someone congratulated me for being so brave. She said to read my work so soon after joining the workshop. It didn't help matters when someone said, "You write so well for a non-native English speaker," and a handful of others nodded their head in agreement. Oh, they are having pity on me. Over the years, these sorts of remarks have not waned. Some native English speakers congratulate me and claim they don't need to assert themselves like me because English is their native language. They are partly right that they may not have to apply themselves as much as non-native English speakers, but those writers still have to learn the writing craft. At workshops, I have noticed some writings fall victim to such mistaken belief, and it jabs me when some critiques I bother to point out become suspect or dismissed. But I don't think of pity anymore. Instead, I swallow hard and think, it's their loss, or I wish these people would judge my writing on its own merit. Native English speaker or not, back then, my eyes gradually opened into a world of writers previously hidden to me as a reader and casual writer. I soon started nursing the idea of writing a book. But what kind of book? I doubted I had enough material or the language to fill in a whole book. I groped in the writing wilderness for 5 months with no bubbling stories in my head to guide me. Meanwhile, I wrote and read disjointed, standalone articles to the group, while I wondered where my writing would fit and whether it could amount to a book. To my colleagues' credit, they cheered me on after every reading I did. When I told them I would give my stories to my family since the stories didn't sound good enough for wider consumption, my fellow writers kept on saying how much they loved to hear more of my stories. By then I had learned the name of the split personality phenomenon that I had housed for a week and that I now miss so much. Writers referred to it almost in deference as the muse, and although I didn't take advantage of it when I had the chance, It's why I write today. But muse or no muse, I didn't slow down. I kept on writing. And since I didn't have to earn a living from my new writing career, I could study how-to books and take my time to learn the new craft. Along the way, I realized the stories that had bubbled in my head and the ones I wrote all related to my experiences in America. My family in Kenya could finally learn what kept me away for so long. Well, why not start with those? Finally, by June 2013, a word had followed a word and a pattern of sorts had emerged. A year later, when I finished drafting a version of a book, I had written over 500 double-spaced typed pages. At that stage, writing a book seemed a possibility. Through a lot of rewriting and pruning, half of that draft morphed into my first and second books. Unexpected America published in November 2016, and its sequel, Entangled in America, came out a year later in October 2017. And I incorporated in both books, with minimal edits, the few stories I had drafted during the special week my mind spent in Storyland. Before Unexpected America published, I set aside one afternoon to sort my papers. I got pleasantly surprised when I came across the first page of the list I made all those years ago of the things I would do if money were not an issue. The list had survived several relocations in a span of 19 years. I read the items, feeling nostalgic, as I checked off the ones I had completed. Item number 13 on the page read, "Write a book." Memories from 1997 flooded in. But even without the benefit of that list, it pleased me to note that I had accomplished most of the items on that page, from travel to investments. So far, the only downer is that in over 8 years, those riotous voices that resided in my head for an entire week have never returned. I now keep myself mentally ready in case they decided I have waited long enough. That's why we travel. Every person needs to take one day away, a day in which one consciously separates the past from the future. Jobs, lovers, family, employers, and friends can exist one day without any of us, and if our egos permit us to confess, they could exist eternally in our absence. Each person deserves a day in which no problems are confronted, no solutions searched for. Each of us needs to withdraw from the cares which will not withdraw from us. Maya Angelou, 1928 to 2014. The Getaway. Have you ever craved change? Felt you could go anywhere at a moment's notice? Leave your family, your friends, your job, and just walk away? I craved that one mid-morning in November 2012, when I couldn't bring myself to focus on anything. Nothing short of a quick getaway from my daily tedium could have satisfied me. I longed to float free somewhere far, far away from California. No phone calls, no emails, and no work. But I had no clue where to go. In search of a distraction, while I mulled on my need, I logged into my email and surfed through the inbox. Nothing interested me. Each sender wanted me to take action. Contribute to a cause, pay a bill, attend a meeting or seminar, the very activities I desired to run from. Where else on the internet could I search? As an afterthought, I opened the junk folder. I did this several times a month and usually caught a stray but useful email. I saw several promotional emails, some from land tour and cruise companies. One of them came from Princess Cruise Lines. When I opened the email, the attachment showed colorful images of boats, people strolling on sunny beaches, relaxing in luxurious settings, gazing at panoramic mountain or ocean views, drinking wine, or eating designer delicious foods. I lingered through the images as they teased my mind. But the tours and cruises were too long, too short, or too expensive. Finally, one promotion sparked my interest. It gave details of a 2-week cruise to the Greek islands, with stops in Turkey and Italy among other destinations, leaving Venice in a week. It beckoned me. The right price, good timing, and great sights. And I had never visited those places. Before I made my booking, however, it didn't occur to me to read about the various destinations or talk to somebody besides a travel agent. In a handful of my previous overseas trips, I had experienced issues like getting lost or feeling unsafe in certain places. Prior preparation would have no doubt alerted me and helped me cope better. But the past had gone out of my mind. Now, I consulted my calendar, which I didn't want to pay too much attention to anyway, and booked the cruise. A week later, I flew from California to Marco Polo Airport in Venice and by late afternoon boarded the Crown Princess Cruise Line, which berthed there for the night so cruisers could tour Venice the following day. In the morning, during breakfast at the buffet restaurant, I shared a 4-chair table with a Russian woman. Katya and I talked about the cruise and agreed to explore Venice together. She didn't mention anyone else, although she wore an expensive-looking ring that could pass for an engagement ring. Before we finished eating, however, a much older white American man joined us. She introduced him as her husband. Why didn't she mention him before? The man used a wheelchair, not agile enough to handle city sights. For a moment, I felt trapped and couldn't think of a way to free myself. Meanwhile, instead of getting his own food or sending his wife, the man called one of the waitstaff and ordered freshly squeezed orange juice. "There is juice here, sir," the waiter said. "I said fresh orange juice from the galley," the old man said. The waiter's face clouded for an instant. I doubt the old man noticed. The wife and I finished eating before the orange juice came. "I'll go to my cabin before we leave," I said. "Do you want me to find you here?" "No," Katya said. "I'll meet you at the gangway." My eyes angled briefly toward the husband. "He isn't going," she said. "He likes to gamble." The man didn't say anything. From the gangway, Katya and I joined others on a water bus for the transfer to Piazza San Marco, St. Mark's Square, or just the square, the main public square in Venice. At the square, I learned the fall season was a great time to tour the city, but it was also the period of high tides when the city became susceptible to floods. Fortunately, we had missed a big one by a mere 2 days. Streets had been cleared, but one could still see an occasional pile of debris at some street corners and curbs. My water bus group and I lingered around the square, while some of us eavesdropped on groups led by tour guides. Soon people gravitated toward whatever interested them. It felt peaceful and quite unusual to walk around a city without noisy cars. Katya and I wandered off and visited quaint shops, including a glass shop where they bent or slumped colorful glass into various artistic shapes and sizes. She entered every jewelry shop we came across, and I hung around or waited by the door. Jewelry so enamored her that she tried on whatever struck her fancy. During our stroll, Katya said she met her much older husband through a catalog by an international marriage agency. The two had been married for 20 years. In later years, she said, he gambled away all their money and even borrowed against their $1 million home. She believed her husband wanted to spend all their money before he died so he could leave her destitute. To escape a slew of her personal gossip, I excused myself. My interest in any city has always been to walk all around the city center, sometimes for miles, and relish the highlights. I have relived such moments when I see on TV a city I have toured. In Venice, I also long to see gondolas carry people and cruise around the many canals and waterways, perhaps even ride on one. So I explored and checked whatever interested me. I walked on bridges, over waterways, while gondolas cruised underneath. One time I stood at a bridge and watched a magnificent sight that I had only seen in the movies before, of those old-world gondoliers dressed like sailors paddle their boats with their hull of passengers, tourists or locals around the waterways, while buildings bore down on them from the banks. By the time my feet became too fatigued and I wanted to return to the ship, I hadn't made the time to take a gondola ride. I think I didn't really want to. Renting and riding on a gondola alone couldn't be fun. Perhaps next time. We set sail for Santorini, Greece that evening during dinner, which I ate at the buffet restaurant. I had chosen to skip the four-course dinner at the monstrous, richly furnished formal dining room. On my previous cruises, the maitre d' usually assigned 8 to 10 diners to a table. Unless a diner chose to eat elsewhere on the ship, he or she shared a table with the same people during breakfast, lunch, and dinner for the duration of the cruise. The few times I joined my assigned table, I noticed some people got to know each other quite well. I had noticed also that on their first night together, instead of giving basic introductions, they went into a litany of impressive careers. Subsequently, they indulged in discussions about the respective countries' social issues, including their political leanings. I sensed they meant to size up their table mates, to decide to whom to pay more attention and whom to ignore or patronize. I always felt self-conscious and uncomfortable at such a table because after I gave a brief introduction, prying personal questions followed. I then felt under pressure and, for the sake of politeness, said things about myself that I never wanted to get into. Besides, I did not want to dwell on work and my everyday life, the very activities that I took trips to get away from for the duration. That's the reason I went to the buffet restaurant, where I could eat alone or pick whom to join without being assigned a permanent table. Whenever I ate there, I met diverse people, and what we talked about came up naturally without pressure or ulterior motive. That evening, I sat alone, and soon a couple asked to join me. Chris and Teresa. Besides basic pleasantries, the couple who joined me at dinner didn't indulge in too much talking. I soon finished eating and returned to my cabin, but it seemed too early to remain scooped inside till my bedtime. To occupy myself, I leafed through the ship's bulletin that listed the day's activities. I found a listing of a singles meeting, the type that cruises usually arrange for people who travel alone. I longed for company, but I hesitated, uneasy about the singles term, which implied a single person on the prowl. Nevertheless, I brushed my concern aside. After all, I needed to connect with others. The room next to a bar was half full when I arrived. The ship's personnel had joined several tables to form a big rectangle with chairs on the outside. As with most of my previous tours, one look around the room confirmed the absence of another black person. But I had no time to wallow in my aloneness, since the facilitator welcomed people as they arrived and kept us involved with a comment here and there. Soon, about 20 to 25 people had taken seats and waited for her to start. She introduced herself and said she worked in the hospitality department. She offered us complimentary drinks, wine, juice, or tea. After a short promo talk about Princess Cruises, she asked us to introduce ourselves around the room. People came from different countries, a mini United Nations of sorts. After introductions, she gave a short recap, then closed the meeting and told us to feel at home and interact with each other. Her job done, she left. People rushed or gravitated toward and sat next to the ones they wanted to connect with or form cliques with based on personal attraction, country of origin, ethnicity, or common language. Without a focal person in charge of the group, I became self-conscious. A stab of loneliness hit me. I felt out of place and I looked from one side of the room to the other, perhaps to convince myself that I did not need to be there. I envied a group of women of Philippine descent who jabbered in Tagalog. They seemed so happy. What if nobody comes to talk to me? Perhaps I should leave. In time, it dawned on me that I belonged there like everyone else, and I needed to rely on myself. If I expected someone to come and talk to me, I could just as well do the same. I craned my neck this way and that, looking for friendly, unattached individuals. A man 2 chairs down looked about him. The chairs next to him on both sides were now empty. He seemed lost, just like me. I waved. "May I join you?" he asked when he got close. "By all means," I said. We introduced ourselves and talked about the vagaries of being alone in such a group. Just then I noticed a woman look over at us across the tables. Similar to the man, her eyes scanned the room as if wondering, what next? I waved to her and beckoned. She waved back and approached. She sat next to the man. We introduced ourselves. Chris and Teresa came from England, and I from California. Because they had difficulty pronouncing my name, I told them to use the abbreviated version, Wanji. None of us seemed in any hurry to leave. So we spent the evening in a robust conversation about our lives and previous trips. Chris had treated himself to the cruise after a bountiful raspberry harvest. In another 2 months, he said, he would take a month's land tour of Vietnam. Teresa had retired as a teacher, and her sister had gifted the trip to her for her retirement. I worked as a real estate broker and I needed a break, I told my new friends, but didn't go into details. In reality, besides my regular activities, I focused on wrapping up my real estate business. Writing had also intrigued me after my had housed the Muse for a week, and although I didn't know it yet, I would start writing in less than 2 months after the cruise. But my major burden remained a monstrous, prolonged lawsuit that weighed me down like a chronic tumor and that had drained me to a point of exhaustion. I later wrote about the rigors of that lawsuit in Entangled in America that published in 2017. But I couldn't tell all that to Chris and Teresa. I had just met them. Before the three of us parted that evening, we agreed to explore Santorini together when our cruise docked there in the morning. Back at my cabin, I watched a TV documentary on the history of Santorini. Santorini is the largest of a group of Greek islands at about 28 square miles. In 2012, it had a population of approximately 16,000 people. The island formed from a volcanic eruption about 1646 BCE. The caldera cliffs, made of jagged and smooth rock formations, rise up 300 meters high from the bay, and the town of Fira, Santorini's capital, perches right at the top. From the old port of Ormos Firon, where cruise ships drop passengers, picturesque white and blue buildings in Fira town can be seen looking down at the bay. The TV documentary said the island had some of the world's finest beaches with black volcanic sand and deep blue waters. Some beaches had unforgettably red or white sand. With such attributes and its mild climate and picturesque views, Santorini turns into a tourist hub in summer, not only for the Greeks, but also for people from around the world. Because the cruise ship anchored away from the bay, after breakfast, the crew transported those of us who wished to visit Fira town to the shore by small boats called tenders. After our tender dropped us at Ormos Firon Old Port, we walked about to get our bearings. The view looked truly magical. It intrigued me to see the elevation of Santorini on TV, but to actually look up 300 meters high and see buildings bearing down on us, I couldn't help but wonder how we would get up there. Just yards away stood dozens of docile-looking mules. They called them donkeys, with their attendants clamoring to get the tourists' attention. Mule dung, urine spots, and intense animal smells covered the area. Chris, Teresa, and I soon learned we had 3 options to get to town. The cable car cost $4 apiece in 2012 and took about 10 minutes to get to town. The wait to catch the car ranged from 15 minutes to an hour, depending on the season. That seemed the easiest and best way to enjoy the panoramic views of the ocean, the smooth and jagged rocks, and the next island. Mule caravan. A ride on a mule caravan of 6 to 8 riders, led by a guide, went for $5 per person. The organizers and the riders touted weaves up the mountain on the back of a mule as a novelty, hence the higher price than that of a cable car. If you are an animal lover, however, or your heart winces if you encounter suffering, skip the mules. I later noticed a lot of whip cracking, and although the whips didn't land on the mules' backs, they made the mules perk up their ears and keep in line as if they knew what doing otherwise entailed. I wondered whether whips fell on the mules' backs if there were no tourists to bear witness. Besides, the guides didn't seem to have rules on how much weight the mules carried, and not once did I see a mule eat or drink. The final option required a tourist to trek up the mountain as natives did centuries ago. But today both mules and trekkers brave a trail, walkway, covered with cobblestones. The trail is bordered by whitewashed walls on both sides, except for the areas where the escarpment is chiseled. The 1,300-meter trail of steps, Caravaladas Stairs, links the old port, Ormos Firon, and Furatown. As it snakes up the mountain, it becomes steeper and narrower, like a staircase toward the top. With this knowledge, Chris, Teresa, and I huddled together to talk over our choices, taking time off from the hustle and bustle of this raspberry farming. Chris did not want to rough it at all. He chose the cable car. Teresa had visited Santorini before, but she didn't mention how she got to town that first time. Now she wanted to experience a mule ride at least once, she said. Although nervous, she wanted an experience as memorable as her previous one when she visited the white beaches. "Who knows? I might never come this way again," she said. A fan of learning about unusual places, I chose the adventurous path, the once-in-a-lifetime trek up the escarpment. I soon realized hardly anyone from our cruise took this option. I learned only later that the walk took 2 to 5 hours depending on one's fitness. The three of us agreed to meet in town. The trail I took ended right at the edge of Furatown, overlooking the bay. Although I didn't keep track, I estimated I hiked for about 2 to 3 hours, although it felt longer. To my relief and appreciation, I found Teresa waiting at the finish line. She never asked me about my experience, which was just as well. There would be plenty of time to talk about it later. For now, we needed to find Chris. Teresa suggested we walk about and look for him, but my harrowing experience up the trail didn't leave me with spare energy. I needed to crawl into a quiet, comfortable place, rest, and calm my nerves. I felt drained, but I must have also looked a sight, because when I told Teresa to go look for Chris alone, she did not insist I join her. I assured her that when she found him, the two would find me right where she left me. Irene and Pedro Peña. The place where Teresa left me, near the edge of the cliff, was dotted by a cluster of dozens of makeshift little tourist shops, some small enough to qualify as stalls or kiosks. Narrow stepped-up walkways meandered between the stalls. Some shops had canopies that shielded against heat, but let generous light through. The canopies straddled the narrow pathways. The shade seemed perfect for tired shoppers to rest and possibly buy touristy knickknacks or clothing the owners peddled. My eyes surveyed the main pathway, next to the cliff, looking for a stall with enough unoccupied space and for a friendly face that might let me get away with a rest without making a purchase. I spotted a Spanish-looking heavyset woman, a motherly type who seemed laid back and likely a person who would welcome a stranger to her home. Besides, she had one of the best shaded stalls with the generous space outside. I could stand there and take a break until Teresa and Chris returned. Although I doubted the woman understood English, I craved a break, so I approached her, ready to use one version of my worn-out travel conversation starters. "Hello," I said. "Can you tell me the way to town?" Nothing seemed confusing about the right direction. A person needed to either head to town or back down the cliff to the ocean, or I could have followed other shoppers. To my surprise and relief, the woman answered in English. "It's easy," she said. "All streets go to town." "Oh, are there good sights close by?" "Did you come from the ship?" "Yes, with 2 companions," I said. "I'm waiting for them. My name is Wanjiru." "I'm Irene," she said. "You want to wait for your friends here?" "You don't mind?" "Wait so you don't miss them," she said. "Thank you." After we talked for a couple of minutes or so about my cruise, I expected Irene to entice me with her merchandise. To my relief, she didn't, for which I felt thankful. Instead, she excused herself, went inside her stall, and returned with 2 high stools. Not long after, her husband, Pedro, joined us and sat on a rock at a distance, perhaps to insulate himself from our chatter. Barely 5'5", he wore work clothes and a small brimmed hat, similar to a typical barrio resident in California. He didn't say much, except occasionally echo what his wife said or answered her when she sought his confirmation. Pedro and Irene Peña were parents to 3 grown daughters, 3 grandsons, and 1 granddaughter. They bought their supplies in Athens and had them delivered by air or sea. When cruise ships stopped coming during the winter months from November to April, they closed their business. They didn't expect many more ships after ours, Irene said, before they closed for the season. How do you make a living working for only half a year? I asked. We run a side business, she said. We own a food business. After what seemed like a long time, Chris and Teresa strolled down the pathway, looking fresh and aglow, jabbering away. I fumbled in my pouch for my digital camera so I could catch the beauty of their stroll. It turned out to be one of the best photos of that trip. These are your friends? Irene asked. Yes, I said. This is Teresa and this is Chris. Irene shook their hands. She said she could borrow stools from her neighbor. I thanked her for the generosity and said my friends and I had places we needed to visit. We bid her and Pedro goodbye. The 3 of us weaved through the meandering stepped-up walkways without much talking, since we had to walk in a single file to let others pass. When we reached the flat area and wide streets in the center of town, we debated on what we wanted to see or visit. Teresa remained nostalgic about the beach with red sand that she visited in her youth 35 years ago. She had talked about it since breakfast. No matter what, she had said, she would revisit that beach. Chris and I had no commitment to any sites, least of all Teresa's beach. We therefore needed to decide whether to join Teresa or do something else. But Teresa had already stated she wanted us to join her. But after I tackled the trail, I felt exhausted and wanted to bail out, but I didn't know how to say it without feeling guilty. I'll do whatever you ladies decide, Chris said. Oh, Chris. The beach was miles away on the other side of the island. A stroll around town would have been more than sufficient for me, but I remained quiet, concerned about our agreement to tour Santorini together. I hesitated to tell them the truth and possibly jeopardize our new friendship. I needed their company for the rest of the cruise. Meanwhile, we ambled along the street, shopping for a taxi as we grappled with what else to do besides a trip to Teresa's dream beach. At one point, Teresa turned to me. This is your chance, Wanji, she said, to see what you may never see again. Really? I said, detesting our singular focus on that beach. Wanji, Chris said, eyeing me sideways, you don't want to go, do you? Not really, I said softly, thankful he brought it up. We don't mind if Wanji does something else, Chris said. Do we, Teresa? No, she said, as long as I go to my beach. What a relief, I sighed inwardly. The Santorini Trek. My desire to break my pact with Chris and Teresa resulted from the path I chose to get to town. I should have avoided the strenuous, unsafe, and stinky trail up the escarpment, but blinded by my wish for adventure and perhaps my need to escape and lose myself completely, let alone earn future bragging rights, I overestimated my body's capacity for endurance. From the start, mule dung littered the walkway's surface and the surrounding area, although most of it was dry. With an occasional urine spot, one had to put up with the sweaty, rotten, suffocating smell. But my excitement of visiting a new town atop a cliff suppressed everything. I didn't even become concerned when I learned there existed no separate trail for humans as I had envisioned. I asked Teresa to take my picture before I started my excursion, the picture featured on the front cover of this book, and that I still treasure. Then I got on my way, walking fast, full of energy and enthusiasm, my water bottle in hand and a sweat jacket and scarf tied around my waist. I didn't remember that marathon trainers advise runners to keep a slow pace at the start of a race. This would prove to be quite a race, a challenge to my body and soul, but I did not know it yet. At the bay, the cobblestone walkway measured about 10 feet wide, set in rises of 4-inch high steps across, each similar to a landing. I would learn later that although this size covered most of the trail, it narrowed to about 6 feet wide as it gradually got steeper and steeper, similar to an apartment building walk-up by the finish line. Every step had a number scrawled in it, starting from 1. I caught up with an older couple a short distance up. The woman steadied herself with a cane and stopped at every step landing, while the man walked a step behind to let her set the pace or to catch her if she wobbled. I slowed and exchanged pleasantries with them. "My wife can't walk much," the husband said. "We'll go as far as she can, then turn back." "Happy walking," I waved to them and resumed my power walk. A show-off, I thought later. After the second bend, the first mule caravan passed me. Then Teresa's caravan came trotting up from behind soon after. We waved and threw words of encouragement to each other, our excitement still untamed. A third caravan followed, and soon all 3 caravans disappeared from my sight. By then I hadn't yet realized that my fellow cruisers took the cable car and the rest rode on mules. After the next bend, 2 other caravans passed me. By then the novelty of such an adventure did not seem important anymore. I thought of the various things I hadn't considered earlier. For one, besides the couple I passed, who must have turned back by then, I remained the lone walker in that wilderness. After covering another generous distance, every part of my body complained about each step I took. The stench assaulted my breathing, which now labored as if I suffered from asthma. Before I reached my destination, however, the stench would become secondary. My spirits rekindled when I met 3 younger women on their way down. I longed to visit with them and have company while I rested, but I settled for a quick chat as they hurried by. It seemed as if their legs couldn't control their downward momentum. Their one Santorini attraction, the women said amidst heavy breaths, was to trek up the escarpment. Unlike me, however, they sized up the trail at the beginning and toned down their ambitions. Instead, they rode up on a cable car and now tackled the trail down. They had walked yards away past me by the time they finished telling me. Their plan seemed better than mine, except the downhill rush strained their knees more. About halfway up or so, it seemed all the mule caravans had passed me. I gave up on anyone else coming along. I needed to put up with the stench and loneliness and cheer up my exhausted body. But fear seeped into my heart. What would happen if I didn't make it to the top? Could there be wild animals that might jump over the wall and attack me? My decision to brave the trail now seemed reckless. I would never have chosen to walk if I had known no other people intended to do the same. At the time, it hadn't occurred to me that people got transported from the ship to the bay at intervals, which meant another group of caravans would come along, perhaps after lunch. For now, I consoled myself. It's the end of the tourist season, and I don't have to compete with throngs of riders and others on foot. Just as well I hadn't read reviews by people who had walked the trail before, but if I had, it would have alarmed me to no end. I finally read those reviews when I returned home to California and learned that an occasional person had fallen off a mule and got hurt. Another tripped and broke an ankle. One woman wrote how 20 or so mules went rogue and charged her. Fortunately, she was able-bodied enough, and it was at the end of the trail where she dashed and scrambled up the last steep steps and saved her life. She got away with cuts, scrapes, and enough traumatic memories to last her a lifetime. And in some cases, fatigue, exhaustion, discomfort, and fear of getting into an accident made people sick. According to news reports, 3 years after my adventure, mules kicked and trampled a woman to death. But I didn't know about those calamities at the time, so in my mind, I needed to dig deeper within myself, squeeze out every ounce of stamina I retained, and inch up the finish line. To distract myself and occupy my mind, I replayed some of my previous travel exploits. These included my 2001 adventure when I climbed the steep steps up the Great Wall of China for about half a mile. Back then, I congratulated myself and took a photo, arms raised and fingers flashing victory for having conquered one of the great wonders of the world. Fortunately, except for the throngs of people on the same quest, no animals littered the steps and fouled the air. And in China, I could have cut my climb short. After all, every climber had to return to the beginning unless he or she wanted to go on a months-long quest. But in Santorini, if I gave up, It meant retracing my steps down that escarpment. That would have been much easier for my lungs, but not for my knees, even if I managed not to slip and fall. And it seemed such a waste to quit after such exertion and miss a chance to claim that I had conquered the Santorini escarpment. So I pushed on. About 2/3 up the walkway, loneliness and exhaustion had become part of me. I became so focused on the trail's task that Chris, Teresa, and my previous life didn't enter my consciousness. The perfect escape I had longed for from the onset. I rambled on and paced myself, depending on how much my lungs could bear. After another curve, I came to an area with 20 to 30 mules lined head to rear along a chiseled embankment, and not a single human in sight. At least I have company. I could not be too far from the finish line. I later learned that due to the introduction of the cable cars, and because it was the end of the tourist season, most mules stayed idle. Without enough spaces around the finish line where riders disembarked, the guides parked their mules along the side of the path, sometimes way down where the trail's gradient was gradual and ran for a long stretch. At first, I thought the guards had tethered the mules, but on a second look, I noticed the animals stayed in line out of habit. They looked docile, but it still concerned me. If they chose this time to rebel, there would be no escape for me. With the concrete walkway littered with dry and moist dung, there lacked a single living plant or drop of water to distract the mules. Perhaps the owners never gave the poor animals anything to eat or drink the whole day. How did the animals fare trotting up and down in the hot sun with weight on their backs? The poor mules just stood there, lethargic, zombie-like, except for an occasional slight head movement to swat a persistent insect determined to poke and get a meal. Deep in my pity party, however, I never lost sight that on that trail it was every creature for itself. I brushed aside my concern for the mules and pressed on. But I kept an eye on them, in case they thought me an intruder or an anomaly they needed to eject. When I got to the midpoint of the parked mules, I turned and looked down behind me. A caravan of about 8 riders approached. Fear struck me. I didn't want that much company. Sharing the walkway with one mule caravan seemed okay, but together with the parked mules seemed dangerous. How could the caravan pass without shoving me into the parked mules? I had the option of sprinting downhill or uphill to yield enough space for the caravan to pass, but I couldn't muster the energy to do either. At the time, every step I took put pressure on my chest. I took a break every few feet to slow my riotous heartbeat. If I exerted myself, my heart suffered pricks of pain and enough pressure to threaten a burst. My labored breathing did not help either. As I pondered the right-of-way dilemma, I looked uphill. To my horror, another caravan ambled downhill toward me in measured steps. Because of the incline, the riders hunched, their torsos hovering over the mules' shoulders. On the verge of panic, as if I couldn't believe what I saw, I started with self-talk. Slowly at first, but the volume and frequency increased the closer the caravans got. What do I do? Where do I go? The 2 caravans kept on closing in. I continued with my barrage of pleas. "Sir, can you stop the caravan and let me pass?" "Sir, we can't all fit in this walkway," and so forth. But no one paid attention to me, least of all the parked mules. They did not even twitch to acknowledge my presence. The only response to my pleas remained the cracking whips and loud voices from the 2 guides. They shooed and chastised their loaded mules when they wandered off the line. I remained standing, almost in the middle of the trail, focused so much on my safety that I could not walk and talk at the same time, or concern myself with the image I portrayed to the riders. Except perhaps to wonder how strange I behaved. I doubt the riders heard my pleas amidst the claps of animals' hooves on cobblestones and the guide's racket. Then the rest of my body froze, except for my head and mouth. My mouth pleaded, and my head turned downhill, uphill, right and left, monitoring the situation or hoping for a miracle. My pleas did not cause a single ripple, but not once did my mind think to scream. Perhaps I did not want to disturb the parked mules in case they rose against me, which I later learned had happened on occasion. When the caravans reached about 40 feet away, on both sides, I gave up on any external help. My fight or flight instinct kicked in. My eyes shifted to the wall opposite the parked mules. I considered a dash and clamber over the wall, but my body remained frozen in place. I couldn't raise a single finger. My brain retreated to autopilot and now argued with itself. I doubted I could have hoisted myself up a 6-foot wall, but even if I somehow managed to get over it, I would have fallen downhill, rolled and ended up hurt, or dead, with my body smashed into one of the rocky crevices. In my mind, it was either death by mules or by falling off a cliff. Did I come all this way to die on foreign soil? To be trampled by mules? What a low, shameful death! Those were my last thoughts before my brain quit the physical world and the essence of my being retreated inward. My every sense, hearing, sight, smell, and others, became mummified. Then my life flashed through my mind like a fast-forward film reel. My family's homestead in rural Kenya. My shoeless little young self. My high school days in Nakuru, my then hometown. My life in Nairobi and California. Then, like the flip of a light switch, my mind went blank. Complete blackout. How long did I remain in that state? I have no idea. When I came to, as if coming from slumber, my awareness took seconds to unfold. First, I became aware of the parked mules. They still stood frozen in place next to me. Then in slow motion, I turned uphill, then downhill. Uncertain of what I saw or perceived, I repeated the process. The two caravans had passed each other. The mules' rears and tails switched this way and that about 30 yards from me, and I still stood in the middle of the trail from where I transitioned beyond conscious self. Still somewhat dazed, I looked about my body. I had no abrasions or broken bones, and in my mind, from when I froze in place and when I unfroze, I, dressed in white pants and top, an image my mind still hangs on to despite evidence to the contrary. What just happened? How did the mules and woman gridlock sort itself out? Relieved, but still confused, I walked the few steps to the embankment overlooking the rocky wildness down to the bay. I needed to take a breather while I collected my thoughts. Perhaps sit on one of the steps and lean my back on the wall, now unconcerned about the zombie mules. Actually, I welcomed their presence. Even the animals' company felt better than my own. But no speck of the dung-littered concrete seemed suitable to sit on. Instead, I leaned on the wall sideways and took sips of water from my bottle and thought about my life. I recalled the long-ago shoeless little peasant girl in rural Kenya who babysat, picked coffee cherries for pay, and did house chores and schoolwork, unbothered by the status of her farm worker parents. As a teenager, her highest goal was to own a motorized scooter, inspired by her first female teacher who owned one. And yet, here she stood on foreign soil, not little or young anymore, having traveled in all the world's continents. So what if she bumped into a little hazard now and then? With gratitude and my nerves calmed and my muscles somewhat rested, I dug deeper within myself and cheered myself on. Most of my walk is over with. Only a short distance to go, I told myself. The worst is behind me. I can do it. At the back of my mind, though, a measure of uneasiness remained. All alone, how could I tell what other danger lurked around the bend? After I rounded a couple of more bends, having given up on exhaustion and disengaged my brain and left it to my legs to do the best they could, 2 more caravans came and passed. None of the riders said as much as hello. Except move aside to yield right of way, neither did I. After another bend, the roofs of the makeshift structures at the end of the trail came into view. This boosted my spirits. Soon after, a final caravan passed me. Then thoughts of my destination came to mind. Teresa and I had agreed to meet there at the finish line, but because I had taken too long, I wondered if she could muster that much patience to wait. But I didn't need to worry about Teresa yet. Just before I turned the final corner, I found a horde of mules now lined up on both sides of the walkway. If I stretched my arms sideways, I could have touched a mule on each side. I had no option but to walk in the middle of the now steeper and narrower trail, darting my eyes from side to side for any sign of restlessness from the animals. It was great timing that the last caravan passed me before I reached that gridlock. Otherwise, I would be telling a different story now, or none at all. As if on cue, only feet ahead of me, one agitated mule grunted and whipped its neck and forelegs toward its companions and ended up astride the walkway. I took a couple of steps back, careful not to stumble down the steep steps. I flailed my arm to shoo the mule. The animal did not budge. Instead, it shook its head and grunted, then bared its teeth. I held my peace and waited for the mule's next move. It stomped its forelegs now and then. I backed down a few more steps. Downhill remained the only safe place I could retreat. By then I feared the mule could galvanize copycats and rush me. I blocked my mind from such an ugly scenario. Fortunately, I saw passengers dismount from the last caravan that passed me. I could see the mules' backs and the heads and upper torsos of the riders. I hoped the guide would see my predicament and help me before he parked his mules and left. I called out to him and pleaded as he helped each passenger alight, freed the mule of its saddle and bridle, and parked it downhill from the previous one. The man seemed deaf to any non-paying customers like me. One woman who had just alighted looked over the wall. "Just pass," she said, waving her arm. "Those mules won't bother you." I doubted the woman had seen the real cause of my dilemma. The only way I could pass was to scramble under the mule's belly, something best left to a stunt person. Other riders, perhaps relieved they had reached their destination unscathed, walked away without even a glance in my direction. Finally, one passenger noticed me. He stepped aside to let others pass. He looked at the guide and then down at me. Perhaps he said something, but I was too far to hear. I sensed he wanted to get the guide's attention. Then the guide noticed him, but except look in my direction, neither seemed to say anything to each other. The man kept vigil, while a young boy of about 12 scaled the wall to get a better look. He sat on the wall. He and the man talked while their eyes remained fixed downhill. They clearly wanted to ensure I got help. It gave me comfort. Someone cared. Meanwhile, the caravan guide unloaded and parked all his mules. Then he walked down some steps, whip in hand. "Hey, hey, hey!" he said as he cracked his whip this way and that. The stubborn mule returned to its spot without as much as a snort. With extra energy that I didn't think remained, I hurried up the steps before the guide disappeared. Better have him as backup, instead of remaining defenseless in case another mule protested against all the ills humans had dumped on its back. "Thank you," I said to the guide from a distance before he walked away. I kept up my hurry to reach the man and boy. Near the top, I strained my eyes to spot and wave to them. No luck. They must have mixed in with others and left. All I found were curious bystanders and passive hangers-on. At the finish line on the edge of town, I had climbed 588 numbered steps, plus 10 more unnumbered ones at the top. I spotted Teresa without difficulty. I had just met her the previous evening at the singles meet, and then for breakfast that morning. But the relief I felt upon seeing her touched me as if she were my favorite family member. The poor woman must have waited and waited, although she later told me she had visited and walked around the shops. "Congratulations!" Teresa said, beaming. "Thank you for waiting," I said. "I admire you." I managed a pained smile but kept mum. I felt tired down to my bones, but admiration felt good. "The mule was hard enough," she said. "And you managed to walk all that far?" "Yes, but you could never pay me enough to do it again." Teresa took another photo of me. The before and after photos did not seem to belong to the same person. Back home. When Chris, Teresa, and I got back together in town, I was grateful when they released me from our group activity. I left the two haggling over fare with the taxi driver they wanted to hire to take them to Teresa's dream beach. I thought of catching a cable car and returning home to the ship, but it seemed such a waste to exert my body to almost a breaking point and not see any part of Santorini besides the trail. I walked around the shops looking at the various merchandise, but except to be nosy and see how they did their shop business, nothing interested me. Besides, I had noticed in previous travels that most of the few souvenirs I bought remained unpacked, or I ended up giving them to others or donating them to a thrift store. So I gave up on shop hopping and returned to the edge of town. I walked along the escarpment, enjoying the panoramic views, close to the end of the perilous trail I just conquered. I marveled at restaurant terraces that hovered like balconies right over the edge of the escarpment. I saw the same older couple I had passed at the beginning of the trail. After they retraced their steps, the husband said they rode up on a cable car. We visited longer this time and talked about general subjects. They came from one of the European countries. The husband said he was retired. Except for nodding in agreement with whatever the husband said or smile, the wife hardly said anything. The man then complained about Americans. The Americans spoil it for everybody. They spoil? I asked. What do they spoil? They tip as if they get money for free, he said. I have worked so hard in my life, I can't afford to give away my money. The man sounded quite bitter about tipping. I became a perfect listener and never uttered one word for or against tipping. I didn't want to prolong the conversation because I harbored a pet peeve of my own. I disliked how cruise ships gouged cruisers with automatic deductions of hundreds of dollars worth of tips from their credit cards, over and above what people tipped individually, especially after single travelers like me paid extra for single supplements for cabins. If a person complained, the ship's personnel at the customer service counter asked him or her to send in a claim after the cruise. I doubt cruisers followed through when they returned home, which negligence I bet cruise lines counted on. After my complaints, a desk attendant gave me a claim form on 2 occasions. But I got caught up in my other activities when I returned home and never filed a claim that I now wonder whether the cruise line would have honored. Oh well. I excused myself and left the couple to their stroll. I visited various structures, including the Church of Our Lady Episcopi. I covered enough ground to claim I had taken a self-directed tour of Town. I then turned around, walked to the station, and boarded a cable car. For the first time, I forgot my fatigue, sat back, and enjoyed the magnificent, intoxicating views and a sighting of the next island. They captivated me so much I forgot to take a single shot with my camera. At the bay, I got into the waiting tender and returned to the ship. The minute I checked in through the ship's security, I rushed to my cabin, and within half an hour, I had freshened and crawled into bed. I started to read a book to coax myself into sleep, but I needn't have bothered. Sleep came fast. By the time I woke up refreshed 2 hours later, I felt quite proud of myself for not giving up. My difficult trek had turned into an experience I would always treasure. Before dinner, Teresa called me on my cabin's phone and said she wouldn't join Chris and me for dinner. Instead, she said she would join her sister and brother-in-law, who were traveling on the same cruise line. Chris always ate early and went to the bar to enjoy a bottle of beer. He said it helped his digestion. This time he postponed his nightcap for later, and instead joined me and kept me company while I ate. Like me, he wanted us to share our Santorini experiences. But he did not have much to tell. He took a cable car both ways, up and down to town. After he and Teresa released me from our pact, they rode a taxi to her special beach. Except complain about how much time they wasted and how far they had to drive to get to the beach, Chris never mentioned what they saw. They hailed another taxi to take them back and arrived in town late afternoon, just in time to take a cable car to the bay, board a tender, and return to the ship. My arduous trek became the feature story at our dinner table. When I finished narrating the harrowing experience, it had turned into a celebratory incident, at least judging by Chris's interruptions of, "Really? You're joking?" "I never joke about a thing like that," I said once or twice. "That's why we travel," Chris said, "to enjoy activities we wouldn't otherwise experience at home." The end. You have been listening to Beyond Conscious Self. That's Why We Travel, and It's Why I Write. Written by Wanjiru Warama. Narrated by Carrie Wimmer. Copyright 2020 by Wanjiru Warama. Production copyright by Wanjiru Warama. Would you mind leaving a few words about this book in a review wherever you bought it? It doesn't have to be a long or detailed review. The main thing is for you to share your opinion. This helps other readers decide if my book is worth reading. Thanks. I really appreciate it. Wanjiru Warama.